10 years after escaping Earth, it started again. And this time, it looked like the animals had been waiting for us. The morning Daniel Ruiz died, the sky above Haven was the color of a bruised peach, 2 suns low on the horizon, the air thick with that sweet alien smell the colonists had spent 8 years trying to name and never quite could. He walked out of his habitat module at 6:14 a.m., carrying a wrench and a thermos of coffee substitute, the same thing he'd done 6 days a week since Colony 3 came online. Nobody watched him go. That detail matters, because after 8 years on Haven, people had stopped being careful. That's what survival does to you eventually. It starts to look like normalcy, and normalcy is the most dangerous state a human being can occupy on a world that isn't theirs. But before we get to what happened in that field, you need to understand something first. Back on Earth, we completely misunderstood what the virus was doing. We thought it was trying to kill us. We were wrong. And that single, catastrophic misreading is why we ended up on a second planet, watching the exact same thing begin again. Let's go back to the beginning. Earth was already gone in every way that mattered. Cities stood empty. Roads were silent. Satellite footage showed forests swallowing highways and skyscrapers, reclaiming everything humanity had spent millennia building. The remaining population, scattered, shrinking, terrified, had barricaded themselves wherever walls were thick enough to matter. The virus had appeared 18 years before the evacuation. It spread fast, global within 8 months. And the scientific community's initial response was reasonable. Identify, contain, treat. Standard pandemic protocol. Except the virus didn't behave like a pandemic. It didn't make people sick. Humans could carry it for years with 0 symptoms. Every test came back clean. Every infected person felt completely fine. The animals did not feel fine. Dogs turned first. Not all at once. That's the detail people always forget. It wasn't a single day where every dog on Earth became dangerous. It was gradual, regional, and because it was gradual and regional, people explained it away. Bad breeding. Environmental stress. Isolated incidents. By the time the coordination became undeniable, it was too late to coordinate a response. Then the birds, then livestock, then the wild fauna. Species that had fled from humans for generations suddenly began moving toward them. And the movement was purposeful in a way that sat wrongly in the mind. Not the frenzied aggression of a cornered animal. Something slower, more deliberate, organized. Entire cities fell within weeks of their local wildlife shifting. Farmers couldn't step outside. Urban parks became killing grounds. The infrastructure of civilization, which requires thousands of people moving through open spaces every single day, simply stopped functioning. What scientists noticed, in those desperate final years, was the pattern. The virus was present in nearly every species, and none of them were sick. It wasn't attacking their bodies. It was rewriting a specific cluster of neural circuits, the ones governing fear response, territorial instinct, threat recognition. It was updating their threat software. And the update designated one thing as the threat. Us. But why? That question went unanswered. Because by the time anyone was asking it clearly, there wasn't enough humanity left to find the answer. The evacuation program had been in planning for 3 years before it launched. A distant exoplanet had passed every habitability test: breathable atmosphere, liquid water, stable orbit, complex ecosystems. Scientists called it Haven, which, in retrospect, was either hopeful or deeply ironic, depending on how you feel about the universe's sense of humor. 100,000 people packed into a fleet of ships and pointed at a star 40 light-years away. 6 months in transit. 6 months of suspended animation and quiet machinery, and the kind of prayer that doesn't require religion. Just desperation, darkness, and the need to believe in something better at the other end. They arrived. and Haven was genuinely, measurably, overwhelmingly beautiful. For 10 years it stayed that way, until Daniel Ruiz walked into a grazing field with a wrench and a thermos, and didn't come back. The Thorin were 6-legged herbivores built like a crossbreed of rhino and bison, thick gray skin, wide flat heads, an expression of permanent placid serenity. In 8 years of constant proximity, the worst a Thorin had ever done to a colonist was knock over a supply crate. Children played near them. Agricultural workers moved through their grazing territories every single day. They were, by every behavioral measure, completely harmless. 2 witnesses were repairing a fence line 200 meters away when it happened. They said the herd had been grazing normally when Daniel entered the field. He was maybe 30 meters in when all 12 animals raised their heads at the exact same moment. Not the way animals respond to a sound. Not that slow, distracted drift of attention. Simultaneous. Precise. Like a single organism operating 12 bodies. One witness said later that the hair on her arms stood up before anything moved. That ancient part of the brain. The part that doesn't wait for information. That just knows. Fired before her conscious mind had processed anything at all. Daniel tried to run. He didn't make 10 meters. The herd didn't scatter afterward. They didn't panic or flee, or show any of the agitation that normally follows an animal's burst of violence. They stood in a loose circle for a moment, and then they went back to grazing, as if nothing had happened. As if he had simply ceased to exist, and the world had closed over the space where he'd been standing. The colony administrator called it a tragic accident. 3 days later, Priya Okonkwo was hanging laundry outside her module in Colony 7 when 46 shrikes came out of the tree line. Shrikes were bird-like creatures about the size of pigeons, creatures that colonists' children had been hand-feeding for years, that landed on windowsills and ate from open palms. They hit Priya in a coordinated dive that witnesses described as tactical, targeted. Nothing like the random, panicked damage of frightened birds. She died 3 hours later. The administrator's report still said isolated incident. Then a man in Colony 1, 2 teenagers in Colony 5, a family of 4 in Colony 9, found in the ruins of their habitat unit after what investigators could only describe as a multi-species coordinated assault. Different animals, different ecological niches, apparently acting in concert, different species, different locations, always the same pattern. Dr. Elena Ward had been Haven's chief xenobiologist since the 3rd month after landfall. 51 years old, hadn't slept more than 5 consecutive hours in over a decade, and had developed the particular brand of calm that comes not from peace, but from having imagined worst-case scenarios so many times that fear runs out of new places to go. When the attack reports crossed her desk, she read each one twice, quietly. Then she requested tissue and blood samples from every animal involved. She didn't tell anyone why. Not yet. She already had a suspicion she needed to disprove. The samples arrived 2 days after Colony 9. Standard battery first. Toxins, parasites, fungi, anything environmental that might explain a behavioral shift. Nothing. The animals were completely, boringly healthy. It was her junior researcher, Marcus, who found it. Marcus had been born on the colony ship during the 6-month transit, and had technically never set foot on any planet until Haven. He was 24, careful by nature, and he ran the analysis 3 times before he walked to Elena's doorway and said very quietly, "I need you to look at something." She looked. The genetic structure on the screen was familiar the way nightmares are familiar. Not quite from memory. From somewhere deeper. Somewhere the body holds things the mind would rather not keep. The virus. Not a variant. Not convergent evolution producing something structurally similar. The same virus, identical, base pair for base pair, that had rewritten the animal kingdom on Earth and ended human civilization on the only planet humanity had ever called home. Elena asked Marcus to leave the room. She sat down slowly and pulled on every logical link in the chain, looking for the one that would break and let her dismiss what she was seeing. No animals from Earth had come to Haven. The quarantine protocols had been absolute. Every organism transported had been screened, sterilized, screened again. The virus should not exist here. It could not exist here. And yet, she called in her 3 senior researchers. By midnight, when they'd finished verifying the results, nobody had eaten and nobody was hungry. One of them said how in a way that wasn't really a question. Elena didn't have an answer. She had a request. The next morning, she contacted the Geological Survey team and asked for their archived core samples. Deep crust material drilled in Haven's first years of settlement, catalogued and shelved and largely forgotten. The careful, slow work of understanding a new world, done before anyone was in a hurry. She was in a hurry now. 4 days into the analysis, at approximately 11 p.m., an alarm triggered on the perimeter sensors. A cluster of thorin, moving in an unusual pattern near the outer habitat fence. Not aggressive, not attacking, just standing, facing the settlement. Completely still, in the way that grazing animals are simply never still. Marcus was alone in the lab. He watched the sensor feed for 4 minutes before the animals turned and disappeared back into the dark. He didn't tell Elena until the following morning, not because he wanted to hide it, but because he didn't yet have words for what he'd felt watching them. Like being observed, like being counted. On the 5th day, Elena called an emergency session of the Colonial Science Council. The virus fragments in Haven's deep crust core samples were billions of years old. Not millions, not thousands, billions. Older than complex life on this planet. Older, possibly, than complex life anywhere in the known galaxy. The virus had been embedded in Haven's geological record since long before multicellular organisms had existed on Earth. It hadn't arrived with the colonists. It hadn't evolved here recently. It had been here first. Waiting in stone, patient in the way that only non-living things can be patient. Without urgency, without awareness, without any concept of the creatures who would eventually land on this planet and give it something to do. The council chamber stayed silent for a long time. Elena let it breathe. Then she watched the astronomy team do in 48 hours what might have taken years under normal circumstances. They pulled archival data, surveys of nearby star systems conducted during the long search for a new home, and they looked at every planet that had previously shown biosignatures. Complex ecosystems, evidence of sophisticated, large-bodied life. Every single one had gone quiet. Not dead. The plants were still there. The microorganisms, the small creatures, the simple stuff had survived just fine. But the large, neurologically complex species, the ones that had presumably been climbing toward something resembling civilization, were gone. Across dozens of worlds. The extinction pattern was focused, systematic, repeating. Not the chaos of asteroid impacts or volcanic catastrophe. Something deliberate. Something that looked, if you followed the logic wherever it led, like maintenance. While the astronomy team was still compiling results, a message came through from Colony 8. A family's domestic animal, a small creature they'd kept inside their habitat for 3 years, gentle enough that their 6-year-old slept with it, had attacked the child without warning. The child was alive. The injury was minor. But the animal had not fled afterward. It had sat in the corner of the room, facing the family, and watched them. Completely still. Until the father had removed it. The message sat at the edge of Elena's peripheral vision as she prepared her presentation. She didn't mention it to the council. She didn't need to. They were all receiving the same feed. The perimeter was getting noisier every night. Everyone already knew. Elena's presentation to the full council 3 days later was the most important thing she had ever said to another human being. She knew it. And she delivered it the way she delivered everything. Clearly, without softening. Because softening is a form of cruelty when the stakes are this high. The virus isn't a disease, she said. It isn't a weapon. It's a system, a universal biological system, distributed across every planet capable of supporting complex life. And it's been there since before complex life existed anywhere. It doesn't harm animals. It doesn't harm humans directly. What it does is monitor. And when a single species reaches a specific threshold, when it becomes dominant enough to begin fundamentally reshaping its environment, consuming resources beyond what the broader ecosystem can sustain, beginning to expand beyond its home world, the virus activates. She paused to let that land. It doesn't attack the dominant species directly. It doesn't need to. It simply updates the threat designation in every surrounding species' neural architecture. The animals don't become sick. They become coordinated, and they begin removing the element that triggered the response. Through the council chamber's reinforced windows, Colony 3's evening lights were on, warm yellow squares in the dusk. Beyond the perimeter, in the fields, shapes moved slowly in the last light. Nobody looked at the windows, but everyone was aware of them. A planetary immune response, Elena continued. Life protecting its balance from a species that's disrupting it. On Earth, we thought we were being attacked. She stopped. We weren't. We were being rejected. Governor Vega said, "How do we treat it?" We don't. There has to be. The virus isn't the problem. Our footprint is. Our expansion, our consumption, the rate at which we reshape everything we touch. She pulled up the 10-year settlement growth map. The spreading network of colonies, cleared land, diverted waterways, atmospheric processors. The unmistakable fingerprint of human civilization pressing itself into a world that had been fine without it. We did here what we did on Earth. We didn't know. But the planet doesn't weigh intent. A young engineer named Farouk, who almost never spoke in council sessions, raised his hand. What if we found another planet? What if we left? Elena nodded to Marcus. The display filled with a map of the surveyed galaxy. Dozens of star systems, dozens of candidate planets, each marked with biosignature data collected over decades of observation. Every single one contained virus fragments in its geological record. Every planet capable of supporting complex life. Without exception. There is no planet we can go to where this isn't already waiting, Elena said. It isn't a local phenomenon. It isn't specific to Earth or Haven. It's universal, complete. Every world where life can take hold has had this system embedded in its geological foundation since before complex life existed anywhere. She let the silence do the work for a moment. We escaped Earth. We cannot escape this. The geologist on the council, Rashida Ferreira, spoke quietly. If it's everywhere, and it's been there for billions of years, who built it? Nobody answered. Nobody could. But the question did what good questions do. It changed the shape of everything that came after. Because Elena had been sitting with something for 3 days. An anomaly she'd almost deleted as a processing error. Something so strange that her first instinct was to assume she'd made a mistake. She'd run it 6 times before she accepted what it was showing her. Human DNA. Not a trace. Not contamination. Ancient, degraded, unmistakably human fragments embedded inside the virus's own genetic structure. Not alongside it. Not attached to it. Woven into it. Part of the original architecture. Older than recorded history. Possibly older than Homo sapiens as a named species. Possibly older than anything the fossil record could account for. Which meant one of 2 things. Either the virus had been deliberately engineered, constructed by something or someone, and human DNA was part of the original design. Or the virus had encountered humans before. Long ago. On other worlds. And those encounters had left a genetic imprint that persisted through billions of years of replication, the way a scar persists in tissue long after the wound has closed. Either possibility arrived at the same destination. We had done this before. Not on Earth. Not on Haven. Before. Long before. on worlds that might not even exist anymore, in a chapter of human history so ancient that nothing remained of it except fragments buried in stone and encoded in the immune system of the universe itself. Humanity had spread before, had colonized before, had consumed and reshaped and moved on, triggering this same response on world after world, and eventually those responses had caught up, and what survived, diminished, amnesiac, stripped of everything except the biological drive to persist, had washed up on one small planet orbiting one ordinary star and started over, forgetting everything. We were never running from a virus. We were running from the universe correcting us, and the universe had been doing it for a very, very long time. In the weeks after the presentation, attack rates across every colony climbed steadily. The projections the science team ran were not ambiguous. They were built on solid data from Earth's final years, overlaid against Haven's accelerating incident curve, and the two datasets matched with the kind of precision that scientists are trained to distrust, and that, in this case, there were no grounds to dismiss. 40 years, give or take. The council debated. Of course they debated. Fortified settlements, electromagnetic barriers, population consolidation, defensive drones, aerial patrol grids, all the things humans reach for when the end is visible and they need to feel like motion. Elena sat through every session and said very little, because she understood what most of the council was still working toward, that every defensive measure required more infrastructure, more consumption, more ecological footprint. A larger footprint would accelerate the activation curve, not flatten it. You cannot fight your way out of an immune response. You can only stop being the irritant. What that actually required was brutal. Colonies abandoned. Agriculture scaled to near subsistence levels. Manufacturing halted. A civilizational retreat so thorough that the word civilization would stop applying. Maybe a few thousand people, living lightly enough to fall below whatever threshold the system was measuring. Not building, not expanding, not mattering enough to be registered as a threat. Hiding, essentially, in plain sight of a planet that had every biological reason to finish what it had started. It might work. It might slow the curve enough to sustain a remnant population indefinitely, or it might be too late, or the threshold might be lower than they thought, or the discipline required to sustain that kind of restraint across generations might prove to be exactly as difficult as every previous version of humanity had apparently found it. During the final council session, before the plan moved to implementation, someone asked Elena whether she thought they could actually survive it. She looked at the analysis on her screen. The ancient human DNA woven into the structure of the thing that had been hunting them across the stars. The evidence of previous cycles, previous civilizations, previous moments exactly like this one. People in a room, looking at the data, trying to find the path. Something survived every previous cycle, she said. Something got small enough and quiet enough and lucky enough to persist, and it eventually became us. She paused. I don't know if that's comforting, but it means the path exists. Someone found it, at least once, and they left traces. In the virus, Rashida said. In the virus, Elena confirmed. Which means the answer, if there is one, is in there too. Written in the only language the universe seems to have made truly universal. She closed the file and opened it again from the beginning. So, I'm going to keep reading. Outside, Haven's night settled in violet and deep. The two moons cast pale double shadows across the settlement grounds. In the fields beyond the perimeter, the Thorin had bedded down, dark, still shapes against darker ground. Peaceful, patient, not malicious, not conscious. Just waiting, the way biological systems wait, with the infinite, mindless patience of something that has no concept of urgency, because it has never needed one. No urgency, no malice, no hatred. No awareness of the small lit room where 51-year-old Elena Ward sat down at her desk, opened a genetic analysis that contained the compressed history of her entire species, and started again from the first line. 40 years. Maybe more, if they were careful. Maybe less, if they weren't. The virus waited in the blood of every creature on Haven's surface. It waited in the stone beneath their feet. It waited, as it had always waited, across 100 worlds where something like humanity had stood in a room exactly like this and asked the same question. Is there a version of us that the universe allows to exist? Elena intended to find out. The animals slept. The colonists locked their doors. And in the patient, indifferent dark of a galaxy that had been running this correction for longer than consciousness had existed anywhere within it, the system held its threshold and waited to see what humanity would do next.
So, that's the end of this story, but there are plenty of other great ones right here. Before you go, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and ring that little bell.